USS Bergall slices through black water, her crew executing a standard mine-laying operation off the coast of French Indochina when it picks up an unusual transmission. Powerful, military-grade, and too strong to ignore. Lieutenant Commander John Hyde abandons his post and rushes to his submarine's periscope. Through the narrow lens, Hyde scans the horizon. The darkness reveals nothing at first. Then a shadow materializes against the night sky. A massive Japanese warship the U.S. Navy has been hunting for months. Hyde has seconds to assess the situation. The Bergall sits in waters too shallow to dive, yet Hyde orders the forward tubes prepared. 6 torpedoes tear across the sea toward the target. 2 explosions illuminate the night, revealing a vessel engulfed in flames. The Japanese ship somehow appears to split in two, but now instead of sinking, both halves are pointing right at the Bergall to attack. The glory days of a sea monster. Before the United States and Japan became enemies in one of the biggest naval wars in history, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already hard at work forging a fleet that could sink any American vessel with a single strike. It all began in the early 1920s, when Japan, fresh from World War I, found itself handcuffed by the Washington Naval Treaty. This agreement, aimed at preventing a global arms race, imposed strict limits on new warships, including a cap of 10,000 tons in displacement. But Japan, determined to expand its naval dominance, had no intention of playing by the rules for long. By the end of the decade, IJN Myoko had already joined the ranks of the Japanese fleet. She would be the lead ship of a new generation of heavy cruisers that pushed the restrictions of the Washington Treaty to its limit. The Myoko-class cruisers, 4 in total, were some of the largest and most lethal warships built during the interwar period. And with each passing year, Myoko only kept growing. By the mid-1930s, Japan's gloves came off, and Myoko morphed into a nearly 16,000-ton monster, her 670-foot silhouette shielded by a 102mm side belt and a 35mm armored deck set to deflect any enemy shells. However, it wasn't just her bulk that made Myoko feared across the ocean. Her main battery, consisting of 10 8-inch guns, could make steel rain across miles of open ocean. Supporting this were 8 127mm dual-purpose guns, 12 long-lance torpedoes capable of outrunning most destroyers, and an aircraft catapult designed to launch reconnaissance float planes to spot targets hiding in the distance. At the time of her completion, she was the most heavily armed cruiser in the world. First strike. When World War II exploded, Myoko wasted no time proving her might across the Pacific, leading Japan's southern advance, from the invasion of the Philippines to the Battle of the Coral Sea. When the Japanese fleet struck, Myoko was there to secure victory. During the Battle of the Java Sea, Myoko joined the fray alongside sister ships and destroyers against the Allied defense in the Dutch East Indies. As British and American ships scrambled to retreat, Myoko's 8-inch guns opened fire, zeroing in on HMS Encounter. Myoko's salvo found its mark, sinking the destroyer before she could retreat. By the time the battle was over, the sea was churned with debris from Allied ships. The Japanese had won, claiming the Allies' last stronghold in the region, and the gateway to vital oil fields. From that moment on, the U.S. knew that as long as Myoko was prowling the waters, no Allied ship would be safe. In order to win the Battle of the Pacific, Myoko would have to fall. However, it wouldn't be until late 1944 that the Americans finally had a chance to strike Myoko. Out at the Sibuyan Sea, the heavy cruiser was cruising in formation with 4 battleships and 10 cruisers racing for a battle against Allied forces. However, it was the Americans who dealt the first blow. Waves of carrier-based bombers from Task Force 38 descended on the Japanese fleet, lighting the horizon with explosions as bombs and torpedoes came crashing down. Amid the barrage, a torpedo slammed right into Myoko's starboard side, near her aft engine room. The detonation erupted with force, damaging compartments and crippling her propulsion. Smoke poured from her hull, but Myoko's crew acted fast. She broke formation and limped into the distance, retreating towards Singapore before the Americans could strike again. A challenger raises. By the later years of World War II, the U.S. Navy had boosted its submarine force with an armada of 120 Bergall-class submarines, an evolution of the earlier Gato class, which boasted reinforced hulls that allowed them to dive deeper, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes to go against even the mightiest enemy warship, and a set of Beaufort 40mm and Oerlikon 20mm cannons to spit fire at incoming aircraft. Among this new generation of naval warriors was USS Bergall, commissioned in mid-1944 and placed under the command of Lieutenant Commander John M. Hyde. Bergall quickly became a threat to the entire Japanese fleet. During their hunts, Hyde and his crew knew how to take advantage of her advanced radar. In night operations, the men could see without being seen, stalking convoys and obscured ships, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Just days after sinking her first victim in the South China Sea, the 4,182-ton tanker Shinsumaru, Bergall used this secret weapon to claim another Japanese giant, Nippomaru, a 10,528-ton fuel tanker. Creeping into striking distance after the sun had set, she launched 6 torpedoes and landed 4 direct hits. It only took minutes before the ship vanished from radar, lost to the deep. By the time Bergall returned from her first war patrol, she was already earning a reputation as one of the fleet's rising stars. On December 5th, 1944, Bergall was sent on another war patrol, this time to mine a reef off French Indochina. For the first few days, all was quiet. Then, as twilight descended on December 13th, a strange, high-powered radio transmission crackled into Bergall's receiver. It wasn't ordinary traffic. It was strong, military grade. Something big was out there. The risks were massive, but the opportunity was even bigger. Hyde gave the order, and Bergall turned hard, closing the distance with the ship ahead at top speed. Showdown. As Lieutenant Commander Hyde and the crew of USS Bergall crept closer to their target, the engines began to shudder with increasing intensity, releasing vibrations so strong they threatened to betray the boat's cover. One false move, and the enemy would know they were being hunted. With no choice, Hyde ordered a cut in speed, throttling down to just 18 knots. For the submarine, it was basically a crawl, but it was what the hunt called for. It took nearly 3 hours until Bergall's radar pinged, revealing that the target was now 26,000 yards ahead. Hyde peered through the periscope once more. Though he couldn't yet confirm the ship's identity, its towering silhouette told him everything he needed to know. A heavy cruiser, flanked by a sleeker light escort. The odds were not good. With the water too shallow to dive, Bergall would be forced to remain on the surface, risking immediate detection. Worse yet, her aft torpedo tubes were blocked by the naval mine she'd been tasked to deploy, and only her bow tubes were combat-ready. They were entering a gunfight with one hand tied behind their back. Still, Hyde was undeterred. He ordered the sub forward, counting on darkness and silence to hide them from Japanese radar. As night settled over the sea, Hyde seized the moment. At 8:37 p.m., with the enemy still unaware of their predator's presence, Bergall fired. 6 torpedoes surged through, slicing toward the hulking ship ahead. Moments later, the still night erupted. 2 torpedoes hit their mark, and a shockwave burst into the sky. Inside Bergall, stunned crew members stared at the blaze. Recording the moment on the boat's logbook, quote, "Saw target break in two at after end of bridge. Explosion forced 2 ends apart so that there were 2 huge persistent fires, which in 10 minutes were 1,000 yards apart." Myoko, one of Japan's most fearsome cruisers, was gone. And perhaps even more astonishing, Ushio, the watchful escort, hadn't made a move. No attempt to go after the Americans. To Hyde and his crew, it could only mean one thing. Both ships had been annihilated with a single strike. As the fires on Myoko burned, Bergall turned. The submarine prepared for the final hit as her engines came back to life, bow slicing through waves toward the damaged Japanese Titan. America was about to claim one of the greatest trophies of the Pacific War. Back from the dead. As Bergall closed to within 3,000 yards of the wounded Japanese vessel, a sudden flash split the sea. 2 torpedoes streaked through the water, emerging not from the American tubes, but from the ships they believed were already sinking. One of the torpedoes slammed into Bergall's starboard side, piercing straight through the torpedo loading hatch and ripping a 5-foot hole in the pressure hull. Water gushed in with violent force, flooding compartments, sending debris flying, and turning crew bunks into wreckage. Alarms shrieked as Hyde began to understand what had just happened. The torpedoes from Bergall had struck Myoko's port oil tanks, triggering a spectacular explosion that convinced the Americans the Japanese ship had split in two. In truth, while Myoko's aft deck was blown off and sank, her vital systems remained largely intact. The damage was serious, but not fatal. The cruiser was still alive. Even more dangerously, Ushio was untouched. While assessing the damage on the heavy cruiser, the escort remained motionless. Knowing that the American hunters would inevitably return to finish the job, Ushio's crew knew all they needed to do was play dumb and wait for the right moment to ambush Bergall as soon as she sailed into their sights. The plan had worked to perfection, and now Hyde and his men had turned into the prey. The American commander barked the order to retreat, and Bergall's engines fired up as the damaged sub lurched away at flank speed. Behind them, Ushio's guns kept going off. 2 more torpedoes cut white trails across the water. The crew held their breath. The first missed by yards. The second nearly grazed the hull before vanishing into the dark. Unwilling to let the submarine get away, Ushio swept a searchlight across the waves and caught sight of the damaged sub fleeing into the night, her hull cracked open. Another torpedo launched, this one flying even closer to the submarine. But luck or fate was with Bergall, and the torpedo sped past her hull without striking her. Hyde's men worked furiously to stabilize the flooding as the boat navigated out of range. Behind them, Ushio gave up the chase, opting to stay next to her damaged cruiser, which, despite remaining afloat, had now lost the ability to steer on her own. That night, both sides bore the scars of battle. The Americans had escaped, but just barely. The Japanese had survived, but they were broken. A Tale of Two Escapes. As the crippled vessels parted ways, each limped toward its only hope of salvation. For USS Bergall, that meant a 2,000 nautical mile run back to the port it had sailed off in Exmouth Gulf, Australia, braving hostile seas thick with Japanese aircraft and warships lurking in every corner of the way. Through the night that followed the ambush, Bergall's crew fought to keep their wounded vessel alive. Electrical fires crackled inside the sub as seawater poured in from the holes in the pressure hull. Lacking proper patching materials, the men stuffed mattresses and broken wooden fittings into the breach. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, at least for the moment. When dawn broke, the Bergall was still afloat, but just barely. Her damage was too severe to risk diving. Hyde would have to gamble everything and surface run to their destination in broad daylight. For the rest of the day, the tension was suffocating. Gunners stood at their stations, scanning the skies with twitchy fingers on the triggers. If Japanese planes spotted them, they'd be the only line of defense keeping Bergall alive. Every wave on the horizon, every shimmer in the clouds, could mean an enemy coming to finish Bergall off. For a while, the ocean was calm. Then, just past noon, the hearts of all sailors on board sank into their chests. A silhouette emerged in the distance, a Kawanishi H-6K, one of Japan's maritime patrol bombers. It circled the area like a vulture, leaving Bergall's crew wondering if they'd been spotted. Hyde didn't wait to find out. He ordered a sharp change of course, steering them away at an oblique angle, trying to vanish into the distance. The aircraft drifted behind the clouds. Then it was gone. The Americans had narrowly escaped doom once more. Still, the encounter rattled Hyde. He knew his crew couldn't count on luck for the rest of the journey, and they would not be able to keep outrunning them. That's when inspiration struck. Instead of staying in open waters and hoping to go undetected, the Americans would steer toward the Japanese-held island of Borneo. If they just kept close enough to shore, perhaps they'd be mistaken for a local vessel heading back to port, and the enemy would let them sail through unbothered. The crew stared at Hyde. Closing in on enemy-occupied land in broad daylight while unable to dive was pure madness. Still, the men trusted their commander. Bergall crept along Borneo's coast, low and slow. As the boat navigated next to the shore, there were no sirens, no gunfire, no patrol boats. Hyde's plan had worked. By nightfall, Bergall had left the enemy behind. Hyde leaned back, confident that his crew was safe enough, at least for the moment, to send out a message back to base, announcing the submarine's first major victory against a warship, as he reported, quote, "busted Bergall's first." But Myoko was not finished. Miracle. As the Americans headed to Australia, the Japanese set course for Singapore. Myoko, with her afterdeck mangled and her power compromised, could only move at 6 knots. Her only hope lay in her escort. However, one of Ushio's engines had been damaged in a prior battle, and she lacked the strength to tow the cruiser back to port. All she could do was lash herself to Myoko and try to steer her in the right direction. By December 15th, 2 days after the encounter with USS Bergall, the situation briefly improved for the Japanese. The crew aboard Myoko had finally managed to extinguish the fires. Soon, help arrived in the form of 2 sub-chasers and a pair of minesweepers sent to escort the cruiser on the final stretch of her journey. However, this sense of relief proved to be short-lived. The weather soon turned against the Japanese. Waves rose like mountains, and racing winds battered the hulls day and night. By December 18th, a full-blown typhoon had formed, raging across the South China Sea and sinking multiple ships in the region. Myoko was paralyzed, with the rescue flotilla forced to anchor down, riding out the storm in the open sea. As days passed, Myoko's fractured hull began to tear apart, with entire chunks of her stern shearing off and disappearing in the water. The same weather that threatened Myoko became Bergall's ally. Just after clearing Borneo, the Americans linked up with another U.S. sub, USS Angler. Orders from command were to scuttle Bergall and evacuate her crew. But Commander Hyde wasn't ready to give up. Convinced that navigating under low-hanging storm clouds and veils of rain could conceal his boat from enemy aircraft, he determined that Bergall still had a chance to get to port. Still, 54 crew members were transferred to Angler, leaving behind only a skeleton team of 29 engineers, 29 volunteers, including Hyde. If they were discovered, there would be no rescue. Hyde had given Angler the order to dive and save the others, leaving Bergall and the rest of her crew behind. The Americans sailed on, timing their speed just right so they could sprint through the Karamata and Lombok Straits at night. Through rain and darkness, Bergall continued her escape across enemy-infested waters, every eye on board scanning the skies and waves. No enemy appeared. It seemed Hyde's plan might just work. Then came the whispers. As Bergall passed near Bawayan Island, the crew on board could hear men speaking clearly and closely. A patrol sailboat was just feet away, with the submarine stationed so near they could hear the enemy crew talking on deck. Not a breath was wasted. The Americans stayed still. One accidental noise, and they would be discovered. The voices slowly faded into the dark. Bergall slipped away, and on the morning of December 20th, she finally made her way into Exmouth Gulf. Commander Hyde was awarded the Navy Cross, and his crew hailed as heroes. Bergall became a legend of the Pacific War. Silent Fall. It took 10 days and the aid of 8 escort vessels in total for Myoko to make her way through the storm. Battling against some of the most monstrous tides it had ever encountered in her service, the cruiser was finally able to claw her way inch by inch back to Singapore, arriving at port right on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy had managed to salvage one of its most powerful and legendary heavy cruisers. However, there were no parades for the crew on board. In the strict tradition of the Imperial Japanese Navy, courage and perseverance were seen not as acts of heroism, but as duty. But it wasn't only the IJN's traditions that made Myoko's return to port feel grim. Despite managing to stay afloat upon USS Bergall's surprise attack, Japanese officials knew that Myoko would never be the same. The damage dealt by the American torpedoes and the storm the vessel encountered on her way back to port was too big to repair. Her entire stern section had to be severed, cut clean behind turret number 5. The exposed bulkhead was hastily reinforced and sealed, but the operation stripped her of any means of propulsion or steering. She was no longer a vessel meant for war, but a giant, forever anchored to the shore. USS Bergall may not have sunk Myoko, but she had taken away any possibility for the Japanese vessel to ever set sail again. Moored at Seletar Naval Base, Myoko was reduced to a stationary gun platform, her guns reduced to defend Singapore from any incoming enemy aircraft and ships. Even in this mutilated, powerless state, Myoko kept haunting the minds of the Allies. Operation Struggle. By mid-1945, the Royal Navy had its gaze set on two of the most powerful cruisers ever built, Myoko and Takao, another heavy cruiser moored in Singapore. To deal with them, the British would employ a duo of XE-class midget submarines stationed in Australia. The mission, codenamed Operation Struggle, began on July 30th, 1945. Upon being towed to the island of Labuan, just east of Singapore, midget submarines XE-1 and XE-3 set sail toward the enemy port. Their orders were to penetrate the heavily defended harbor and destroy the two Japanese cruisers before being detected. Over 11 hours, the midget subs crept through 40 miles of enemy-infested waters, navigating minefields, patrol craft, and anti-submarine nets. As XE-3 approached her target, the crew suddenly spotted a Japanese tanker and escort ship closing fast. With seconds to spare, the sub crash-dived, barely avoiding detection, only to realize they'd settled directly onto a mine. The crew froze. Miraculously, the mine didn't detonate, and with painstaking care, they managed to slip away without a scratch. When the submarines finally reached the anchorage, Takao loomed ahead. Lieutenant Ian Fraser, commanding the sub, maneuvered beneath the cruiser, but falling tides and the ship's grounded hull left barely any clearance for an attack run. Diver James McGinnis had no choice. The space was so tight that he removed parts of his breathing gear and squeezed through a half-open hatch, scraping his body against the submarine's bulkhead. Once outside, he worked as fast as he could, scraping away seaweed, slicing his hands on jagged barnacles, and placing 6 20-pound limpet mines in pairs across 50 feet of hull. When McGinnis finally crawled back inside, exhausted and bleeding, the crew tried to release the sub's 2 massive demolition charges. Only one deployed. The other was jammed, and the tide was trapping them beneath the ship. For nearly an hour, the submarine's crew attempted to break free with little success. But then, just as scuttling the boat seemed inevitable, the current shifted, and XE-3 broke free. Meanwhile, XE-1, tasked with destroying Myoko, searched in vain for the damaged cruiser. Though her position had been confirmed, she was nowhere to be found. Tides were dropping, the harbor was crawling with Japanese patrols, and the midget sub was moments from discovery. In a desperate move, the crew offloaded their explosives next to Takao and retreated, sparing Myoko from destruction once more. At 9:30 p.m. on July 31st, the charges erupted beneath Takao, ripping open her hull in a 60 by 30 foot gash and flooding several compartments. She was rendered permanently immobile. The end of two legends. Myoko remained powerless yet afloat in Singapore's harbor for the remainder of the war, and it wouldn't be until Japan's official defeat in August 1945 that the heavy cruiser would finally fall into the hands of the Allies, being surrendered to the Royal Navy the following month. With no use for the shattered warship, British forces towed Myoko to the Strait of Malacca, where she was unceremoniously scuttled alongside other remnants of the Axis fleet that had once ruled the seas. She was the last of her class, and she sank beneath the waves, marking the end of a dynasty. As Myoko faded, thousands of miles away, her old adversary sailed on. After surviving her brush with Myoko, USS Bergall returned to service, continuing her journey through Cold War waters as part of America's global fleet. She patrolled both the Atlantic and Pacific, and when her service with the U.S. Navy came to an end, she found a second life under the Turkish flag, serving into the 1970s, before her final decommissioning in 1983.